Hey, everybody. Today for you, podcast number 39. Today's podcast is titled Mr. and Mrs. Fix-It. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of your weekly Limitless Life Network podcast. I'm Dr. Pete Lombardi, and sitting next to me is my beautiful wife, Sandy. And this is the weekly Limitless Life Network podcast, where we are dedicated to helping you flesh out the limitations that are preventing you from reaching your goals and living the life that you deserve. And before we get started talking about what we're going to talk about today, I want to take a moment to thank you all for listening each and every week. Really appreciate our listeners. And I've been super loving the feedback and the comments that I get when I see you out and about, as well as people that chime in online. So thank you so much. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're a new listener, thank you for tuning in. That way you can catch up on any of the other podcasts as well. So let's get started on with the show. Today, I've invited my wife, Sandy Lombardi, to join us on the podcast. And I really wanted to interview my own wife. Behind every great man is an even greater woman. And here she is, brought to you live, my wife, Sandra. And we've been married 27 years, and it's going pretty good. And at least we're still married and we're sitting next to each other on a podcast. So this is totally off the cuff today. My wife does not always like to do things this spontaneous. So she does have a few notes, but for the most part, she's a great champ and a great sport for being involved in the podcast today. So I want to thank her for joining us. So thank you, Sandra.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. See, she has a nice voice. You have a good radio voice. Nice. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about, I've already kind of briefly mentioned, and that is marriage. And I don't know if the backstory on us is that we dated for a really long time before we got married. So, yeah, we dated, I think it was your freshman year of college, my sophomore year of undergraduate college. We met each other. Where did we meet? Do you remember?
I remember. We were at Oswego State and met in art class, actually, because we were both taking art class as a requirement. Met a cute person in the class, and then we both minored in art.
Yeah, how about that? So I was a biology major, she was a business major, and on the campus we would have never crossed paths probably if we didn't have to take a humanities credit, and we both took an introduction to drawing class, and since we never would have had classes together, we decided to just keep adding an elective every semester. And then lo and behold, we both ended up with art minors, which is kind of funny. Anyway, but yeah, we dated all the way through graduation and even into chiropractic college. And I proposed to my now wife at the end of chiropractic college. And so, yeah, long dating period. We dated 7 years before we actually got married. So I've been with this woman for a long time.
Yeah, longer than we've been apart.
Yeah, so she's been stuck with me for a while. So you got to think of the ability of this woman to tolerate me for that long. Just absolute saint status. So if you remember, before we got married, we had to speak with the pastor a couple of times. We had to meet with the pastor who, did you know the guy? Because it was your family church.
Yeah, but no, the pastor that I grew up with had moved or retired. So this was a pastor we didn't know.
Okay. And so before we got married, we had to have meetings with this pastor, and he was basically going over what marriage really was all about. Mm-hmm. And do you remember what stuck out to you the most in that, I guess, those two meetings that we had?
I do, because we just spoke about this with our son and his now wife. the thing that stuck out to both of us the most was he said you had to put God first in the marriage, and it was like a triangle. So God's at the top, and he always has to come first. And then it was the two of us next to below God. And that's very challenging in of itself. And then what he said, once we had kids really hit home was, and your kids always have to come below you and your husband's relationship. And we struggled with that for a bit when we had the three boys young, and just, it requires so much time and focus. And I poured myself into raising the kids, and you were pouring yourself into practice. And before you know it, you're like passing in the, here and there. And we had to dig deep and get really intentional about remembering that. And I'm glad we went through that stretch, but it made us realize that we had to work at it, and we've been doing that ever since.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was definitely a challenging time because three young kids with lots of energy, they draw your attention so quick because they're so needy, right? And my tendency was, well, I'm going to contribute to the family by focusing on work. And you have to, right? You have to do that. And your focus was, hey, I've got to raise these boys, and I've got to make sure everybody's fed and clothed, and just getting through a day was oftentimes difficult. And then bedtime, and it's exhausting being a parent.
Yeah.
Well,
and a huge transition. I think we're watching our son and his new wife trying to figure out what that's going to look like. And I had been working and was still trying to do remote consulting for a firm I was working for, and being a new mom, and it just changes dynamics. So I think super important point for every couple to take away is it takes work and focus on the two of you. And that was really good advice, that because if the two of us aren't good, then our family's not good.
Right. Yeah, I think that was solid advice. And I think there was something else that we wanted to talk about too. I know we didn't really talk about in the preamble, but it was about winning. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I had listened to a marriage podcast recently, and I was sharing this with our son, and it talked about, often we hear like, well, you have to compromise when you're in marriage. And the speaker said, that's not good advice, that when you get married, you're both on the same team, and either the whole team wins or the whole team loses. And I had to think about that a bit, but it's so true. Like, if your husband's going to lose, then you're losing because you're on the same team. So you have to really strive to figure things out that will make you both win. So it's not compromise, it's figuring out a strategy that you're both winning.
Yeah. And I love that. It's definitely not the easy route, right? Like it's a lot easier to probably to pick one way where one person wins, but then if the other person loses, then you really both lose. And that was kind of a revelation for myself, because oftentimes couples will do that in arguing. They'll get into arguments and somebody wants to win the argument. And so then the winner of the argument is now married to the loser of the argument.
Yeah. A good friend of ours, Mike, shared that at Kelly's memorial service, that he realized that one day that if he won, that meant his wife was losing. And it was really good wisdom he shared. Yeah,
for sure. So we all come into relationships with different tendencies, don't we? So one of the actually, you gave me a title.
That's right. I forgot that.
Sandy would always call on me when something wasn't working correctly, and I would love to come in and try to solve like the mechanical problem, whether it was the dishwasher or a sink that was leaking or a toilet that was plugged. And I would come in and I'd figure it out and I'd fix it. And I'd be like, so, you're married to Mr. Fix-It here, right? So I'm like, just call me. I'm Mr. Fix-It. And she kind of liked that. And you used to call me that. Right. So, but you have a tendency too, don't you?
Yeah. And I didn't realize it till, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Katrina Potter, who was on this podcast a few weeks back, held a retreat that I attended, and had some breakthroughs on my tendencies and things from my upbringing. And I was the rescuer she talked about, and carried over as a mom big time. Wanted to try to fix everything for my kids or rescue them from the situations that they got themselves into. And wisdom comes over the years and doing things one way and realizing that you take away from your child's growth and their resiliency when you do that, because the process is where they learn how to rebound, they learn how to grow through struggles, and you can't not allow them to go through it. So still in the process and applying that, as we still have Grace home. She's 11, soon to be 12, but big learning curve for me of letting them feel pain. You know, it hurts to watch your kids fail and go through tough times, and that still really is a struggle for me, but learning that I need to let it happen.
Sure. I think we all kind of have this idea of a fairy tale ending where it always comes out, everything works out and everything's smooth and perfect, like the Hallmark Channel or something like that, where it's always a happy ending. And life is not like that.
No.
And when life, has a real curveball or a hard moment, if you've never experienced those things, it could really throw you for a loop. But if you've had disappointment and you've had to fight through it on smaller scales, it's a lot easier, I think, to handle the bigger ones when they happen, because there will be disappointments in life, without a doubt. We've certainly experienced a few. So that's a good one. That's a really good one. So
this is a little bit sidebar, but going through those things, like, I think so many people might look at your life or my life and think, oh, they've just got it together. But we have a community of really inner circle that knows our life and we share life with, and they know it's the hard times, and they celebrate our victories, but they also walk through those valleys with us, and they're going to come. So it's so important to have that really close knit group of support who, really knows what's going on, because we all have it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't know how people do it isolated.
Right. We aren't meant to do life without that support.
Yeah, for sure. So Mr. and Mrs. Fix It, here we are. So there's another thing that I think that you've learned, which is kind of point number 3, and that's putting others first isn't always the best.
Yeah. I guess I don't know how I developed that, but I always put myself last or below first for sure. And I had a hard time not committing to something if I was asked, or meeting others' needs before my own. And I realized that by doing that, I was putting my husband behind whoever I was accepting, or my kids. So someone had to lose out in that equation. So that's been a learning step for me as well.
How did you come to realize like what was can you think of any like moment or situation where, I don't know, where you saw that it was becoming very obvious to you? Was there any situation that stands out in your mind, or no?
You thinking of the wedding, or?
I don't know. I'm just asking.
Well, like I was just saying, we watched the video from our son's wedding recently, and I was like, my parents were in the last row with my brother. And I was like, how did that happen? And normally I'm all over that, making sure everyone is taken care of, and, everyone knows somebody at the party to not feel left out. And I was just fully present at my son's wedding. And I'm glad, I was just focused on them and sitting up front where I should be. And I didn't realize my parents had which is fine, but they chose to sit in the last row. But that, I guess, is an example that there are certainly lots of times where you should be just fully present for yourself in a situation or a setting. And
I wasn't necessarily going for that one, but that works, and I think our listeners can totally relate with that. So that's helpful. So And that also kind of brings in point number 4, and that's the process of learning to say no.
Yeah.
So what can you share with that? Like,
I think it ties in a lot with what we just spoke of. That when I put others first, that I was saying yes to everything, anything I was asked to do, whether it be volunteer work or things at church or sports teams, and just always saying yes.
what about like opportunities? Like, so for instance, with kids, your kid may be gifted in a sport, right? So maybe they're really good at basketball, but they're also really good at, say, gymnastics, and the seasons overlap, but they're also good at soccer too. And that they have a program for that. And next thing you know, you've signed your kid up for
Yeah.
3 different sports, and you have to run them there, and then you have to have, and you're juggling all these things to try to what are we really trying to do there?
Yeah, yeah. And we've been super intentional about that, really allowing our kids to get involved in one main thing, because we value freedom of our own time, values of family, and our faith, and not letting anything infringe on that. Like we protect our Sundays. We, want to make sure we have nights home where we have dinner together. So yeah, we've had to say no to different opportunities or programs. And it's kind of like that. Sometimes it's that squirrel. It's like, that wasn't on my radar at all, but someone's like, yeah, your kid's really good at this and they have this opportunity, but that's not always great. Like we have to really assess and protect the values and our time, that we aren't just crazy running all over the place.
Yeah, for sure. I know that I've shared some comments from a guy that I've listened to and learned a lot from, Rick Sapio, and he always said that, and this is a gentleman that interviewed 20 billionaires, and he came up with a bunch of different themes that they all had, and one of them is that they said no way more than they ever said yes. So it was a lot of no's and an occasional yes. And usually it was a yes because it aligned with their values.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great filter for all of us to think about with, decision making based on values. Does it align? And it's okay to say no.
Very good.
If it doesn't. Yeah. And our last point today has to do with setting limits of protection. What can you share there? Because I think this is really a really cool concept that you kind of worked up.
Well, I was thinking back. I read a book when the boys were little about setting limits and not putting your child, but this could apply to us as adults, into a situation where they're going to lose. Like if they don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge yet, then you don't put them in the situation. And that's been, I think, huge with technology and cell phones. We've been really intentional of not allowing our kids to have those things before they are knowledgeable and prepared to have that responsibility. Is that kind of what you were
Absolutely.
thinking?
Yeah, for sure. And I think about it too in terms of like, it's basically trying to, at what point can you exercise self-control?
Right.
How old do you have to be, or how mature? I mean, there's adults today that are, 50, 60 years old that don't have self-control. But yet, and then there's teenagers that have great self-control. So it depends on the individual for sure. But self-control is really a fruit of the spirit. And so, that's something that we've been trying to, I think, foster in our children, to develop that ability to tap into the ability to control your urges and desires.
We were just talking the other day and we were driving to church, like even as adults, technology, our phones, it's addicting, like our brains almost crave that stimulation. And I was saying, if we struggle with that as adults, think of it for a 16-year-old. So I think, even for ourselves, setting limits on our use of our phones and And again, being present where you are, like I have to constantly watch myself with that. Like, am I actually in the room with my daughter, like when we're doing homeschool, or am I checking my phone and getting distracted? And I have to really catch myself with those things. So setting limits for ourselves as well as our kids.
Yeah, setting limits oftentimes allows you the capacity to live a richer, more full life because you're more connected, and like you said, you're more present. It's super, super valuable. Well, I think today you absolutely nailed this, Sandy, and this has been a fun podcast, and it's been an absolute joy to have my wife on the podcast. I think maybe we should start a second podcast of just you and I. Anyway, I want to thank everybody, each and every one of you, for listening, tuning in each and every week. It's absolutely an honor to be delivering this content to you. So make sure that you tune in next week to stay connected, be inspired, and keep stripping away the limitations that are preventing you from reaching your goals and living the life that you deserve. So we'll see you next week on the podcast.